So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's talk. We're delighted to be joined by so many of you on a cold, wet evening. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, as you'll have seen in the guidance, so do put those into the Q&A and we'll take them at the end. It gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend, Tobit Curteis, who is going to be the principal speaker this evening, and I'll come in the middle section of the talk. Tobit and I studied the history of art together at the University of Warwick, including a memorable term sharing a flat in Venice. And from Warwick, Tobit went to the Courtauld to study wall painting and historic built environment. And from there established flourished and went to Cambridge, but undertaking work all over the UK and internationally. And particularly, Tobit has developed an expertise in the field of environmental monitoring and control within historic buildings, recognizing that his work as a wall painting conservator was kind of fruitless if the issues to do with the environment were not tackled and addressed and understood. Recent projects include research and development for environmental controls at St. Paul's, at the Old Naval College, Greenwich, at the Palace of Westminster, at York Minster, and projects that are being undertaken in Malta and Cyprus. He is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, of the International Institute of Conservation, and is also the advisor on wall paintings for the National Trust. So I'll hand over to Tobit at this point to introduce the talk and take us through the first section. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Daniel. I take it everyone can see and hear everything. I will expect someone to tell me if they can't. It's great to see so many people here this evening, albeit remotely. What we're going to be talking about this evening, broadly, are two wall paintings, two detached wall paintings by George Frederick Watts. They don't look like wall paintings, I'll admit, but that's what they are. And how they came to be in this sort of state, how they're going to be conserved, and what it is we've got to worry about in the long term to make sure that they survive. It's a gallop through quite a lot of material, so we've split it into three sections to make it more accessible. The first section, I want to take you through the history of wall paintings, how Watts and his fellow Victorian contemporaries came to be working in the way they were by the 19th century, how wall paintings developed. Then Dan will take us on a tour of how these paintings were built, how they were made, and how they came to be taken off the walls. And then it'll come back to me and I'll take you through the conservation element of the project. One thing I want you to think about while you're listening this evening, some of you I imagine will be sitting in houses with lovely canvas paintings on the walls. Some of the grander ones of you might even have wall paintings on the walls, who knows. You're sitting there emitting about 100 watts of energy, each and every one of you. You're evaporating 30 to 70 grams of moisture at the moment. All of that is disappearing into the air around you, and then it's being absorbed into your paintings. The canvas on which those paintings are executed is meshing and twisting very slowly. The paint layer is doing something rather different. If you had really good hearing, you could actually hear all that movement taking place. That's what causes paintings on canvas to deteriorate. It's what causes most works of art and organic artifacts to change. So while you are there, while you are breathing, while you are emitting, you are part of the conservation issue we'll deal with. And we'll pick this up right at the end so you can see how it's relevant to this. Right, so let's start with English wall painting. We're jumping back quite a long way. When I am at a drinks party, as I used to be in the olden days, and people say, what do I do? And I say, I'm a wall painting conservator. Their first reaction is, well, are there wall paintings in England? You must spend your time working around the world. Well, the truth is, up until the 18th century, almost every building was painted. So a quick run through the sorts of things. I mean, I'm starting in the 11th century because there were an awful lot of churches being built at the time. They were all painted, like this lovely 11th century church in Hardham in West Sussex. Biblical and decorative paintings. Paintings didn't necessarily have to be figurative. They could simply be decorative or architectural articulation, like this. Here you've got a place called Benjo in Hertfordshire. Very common sort of decoration where the blocks were picked out. It's just trying to smarten up the poor, the cheap plaster walls with what's known as masonry pattern, run for 300 or 400 years in various guises. Figurative paintings, this wonderful little picture of Thomas Becket at Hawkston outside Cambridge. Paintings to venerate, paintings over altars, paintings which were part of the liturgy. And then narrative paintings. Now, narrative paintings at this period were almost always biblical subjects. Here at Little Missenden, you have the very badly damaged history of St. Catherine, and then a wonderful and oversized St. Christopher on the north wall in front of you. It wasn't only churches. Churches survive relatively unchanged from the medieval period, and so we tend to see church wall paintings, but actually it was all buildings. Here is Longthorpe Tower at near Peterborough, 14th century. Very unusual, very fine domestic wall paintings. As I say, these are normally lost because domestic buildings get changed far more than churches do. The subject matter was also diverse, curious. While there are the straightforward biblical subjects, which everyone would have recognized, there were also some very curious metaphysical subjects. Here, this is a painting we discovered a few years ago in Ilkeston St. Andrew, and it's a wonderful wheel of fortune that has been somehow woven into the Christian iconography with unique in Britain, probably unique in the world, these huge eyes. Can you see those eyes sort of floating around in the middle in the individual sections? So the subject matter was diverse and various. Dooms, wonderful doom painting at Coventry Holy Trinity. You can see as we're going forward in time, things are becoming more ornate. The appearance is changing, the colors are changing, the painting materials and types, the technique is changing and developing. Now, people often say when we're looking at archaeological paintings, at church paintings, which look battered and faded, what did they look like originally? There is this impression that it was all sort of rather dull ochres and things. It couldn't be further from the truth. On the right-hand side, we've got the Tickell Psalter, which is in New York Public Library. And next to it, that little saint is one of the figures from Ilkeston that we just looked at a moment ago. These churches would have looked like they had manuscripts painted on the walls. It would have been as bright and vibrant and completely out of keeping with what we now see as the medieval church. Over on the left-hand side there, a wonderful painting about 1200 from Rochester Cathedral, which survived extremely fine. Another wheel of fortune, rather unusually. Extremely fine. It was bricked up for most of its life, and it has survived in close to its original colors, which you can see are very, very rich and similar to the Psalter. Who painted them? This is all coming towards G.F. Watts, by the way, in case you think we've completely lost our way here. Who painted these things? This is the traditional idea, certainly with medieval paintings, that you had monks and people in monasteries, people who were illuminating manuscripts. They were also painting wall paintings. Well, there is an element of truth to that, particularly with very fine sculptures and obviously manuscripts. But the truth is that it was an enormous industry from the earliest days. Every church was painted. I mean, there are 16-some thousand listed churches today. There have been many periods when there are many more. Domestic buildings were painted. Even the lowest hovel would have been painted pretty crudely, but it would have been painted. it needed painters, it needed pigment, it needed people preparing the media. So there was this enormous industry. I rather like this slide. It is rare that the painters and the people preparing the pigments actually got as far as getting into the manuscripts, but this is a rather good example. And what I particularly like is the chap on the left. You can see he has a palette, which is an oyster shell with a blue pigment in, and there on the right is a real one, which was discovered not so long ago. In the middle is a pile of ultramarine made from lapis lazuli. As early as the 12th century and probably before, lapis was being shipped in from Afghanistan at a price greater than gold. There was an international industry supporting the painters. Early on, this period, and later, there was quite a strict guild structure, but there were two guilds. There was one called the painters and one called the stainers. It is an oversimplification to say that stainers became what we would now regard as artists and painters more of the decoration side, but there were very strict rules on what you could paint, which guild could use which particular medium. It was very carefully codified, apparently to protect the art. Other more cynical people might say a closed shop to protect the trade. But there was a structure in place for this enormous industry. In the 16th century, the guilds came together to form the slightly unimaginatively named Painters Stainers Guild, which still exists today in the form of the Worshipful Company of Painters in London. Leighton was a member of that as well. And then wall paintings in churches changed dramatically with the Reformation and the Civil War less than a year later. But of course, wall painting in churches continued, but much more important after this time is domestic painting, mostly in grand palaces and houses. Here we've got Isaacson's painting of the staircase at Knoll at the beginning of the 17th century. Kent in Hampton Court, the King's staircase. I mean, these magnificent monumental paintings, you can immediately see the influence of European Renaissance by this time. In fact, if you go back to Isaacson, you can already see that sort of strap work, that grisaille decoration, the grotesques coming directly in from northern European Renaissance, but ultimately from Italy and the classical Renaissance. Hogarth at St Bart's Hospital, where a project is just starting to conserve the building and the wall paintings. And then we move on into the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century, a lot of things changed. First of all, there was an enormous amount of wealth of empire for building, for decorating churches, and paintings were a huge part of that. There was also a rediscovery, if you like, of the medieval decoration that had more or less been lost. A lot of the medieval paintings were lime washed over, but antiquarians were discovering these things and reinventing, reframing our great past and recreating the paintings. Here you've got handbooks started to come out explaining how to do paintings. And on the right, A.H. Church, who was the professor of chemistry at the Royal Academy, wrote an absolutely key book. And it was only when I was chatting to Dan earlier on this afternoon, I checked the dedication by Church, which is to Sir Frederick Leighton, who has always shown a deep interest in the subject and has greatly encouraged its author. This book is by permission dedicated. So from the earliest point, Leighton and his group were terribly interested in the chemistry, how it all worked, how the paintings were executed. They were also becoming fascinated with Italian Renaissance painting, how the great painters, how Giotto, how Cimabue were creating their paintings. Alongside the financial wherewithal came the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, huge numbers of pigments were available, media were available which were never there before, things which were actually relatively stable and affordable. I mean, blue pigments had been hideously expensive and not that good, apart from one or two of them up until now. Suddenly you could have pigments which were stable, which put up with being put on alkaline walls, and they were cheap by comparison. People were pulling together the whole books of historic patterns. You've got Owen Jones' The Grammar of Ornament here. And out of this came the huge Gothic revival in painting, and obviously in architecture as well. Here we've got George Gilbert Scott's redecoration of the Worcester Cathedral Lady Chapel. You can see it reflects medieval painting, but it's somehow bolder, it's somehow stronger. The saints all have slightly squarer jaws than medieval ones in that very, very Victorian way. As the wealth grew throughout the country, this type of painting spread. Here you have the absolutely magnificent Rochdale Town Hall, Heaton, Butler and Bain at the end of the 19th century. Huge dramatic recreations of a sort of faux medievalism, a faux Gothic. Pugin, I thought of some Palace of Westminster stuff, but actually I decided to put this little chapel in Albury, which is idyllic little church. If you're ever in that part of Surrey, do go and see it. And then George Frederick Bodley, lots of Cambridge colleges, enormous amounts of churches. The reason I put Bodley in is actually not for Bodley himself, who's a fascinating painter. And for those of you who don't know it, Michael Hall's relatively recent monograph on Bodley is hugely entertaining and interesting to read. But the reason Bodley is on is this man, who is called David Parr. He was the principal painter for a firm called Leach and Sons, and Leach and Sons were the people who actually painted these. And we say a scheme by Bodley or a scheme by Leighton, of course, and, well, a scheme by Bodley at least. Other people were painting them. Leach was the chief painter. Every day of his life, he used to come back to his tiny little house in Cambridge, which is sort of about half a mile in that direction, and he brought his paints back and he practiced, and he filled his house with the sort of decoration he was putting in the churches. He recorded every detail, and so you have this wonderful experiment of Victorian or late Victorian painting taking place over his lifetime, which survives, which a wonderful trust has just conserved. Do try and visit the David Parr House when we are allowed to visit places again. On a grander scale, we have Thomas Gambier Parry and people experimenting with technique. Now, Gambier Parry's great gift to painting of this time was something called spirit fresco. Fresco painting, a lot of you will know, relies on watercolor pigment or wet pigment being put into fresh calcium hydroxide plaster. As the plaster sets, it grips, it calcifies around the pigment particles and keeps everything stable. It's a wonderful form of painting. Vasari saw it as the greatest form of painting there was. The Victorians felt they ought to be able to do this, but it doesn't work in the north very well. We don't have those lovely dry Italian summers in which this sets well. So a group of people, and Gambier Parry was the most effective at this, tried to invent a new system to give us a fresco-like technique which would work in the north. And he came up with, he called it spirit fresco. It's got all sorts of strange things, oil of spiked lavender and elemi wax and all sorts of interesting things. It works quite well, and it does look almost fresco-ish. He was friends, as many of you will know, with Frederick Lord Leighton, and one of Leighton's earliest monumental paintings is this lovely piece at St. Michael's in Lyndhurst, The Wise and Foolish Virgins, where he was using Gambier Parry's spirit fresco medium, and it has survived pretty well. It's a very nice, an unexpected church on top of the hill in Lyndhurst. Again, well worth visiting. And so finally we come to G.F. Watts. Now he, like his contemporaries, was fascinated by technique. Yes, they wanted to create wonderful works of art, but they wanted to do it in a way which would survive like the ancients had done. Now here at Lincoln's Inn, Newhall, as you can see, his picture, which is the School of the Lawgivers, reflects Raphael's painting in the Vatican. And he did create this in fresco. Well, needless to say, it didn't work very well. So an awful lot of time was spent repainting and fixing and restoring it. But it just goes, it just shows how interested he was in technique at the time and getting that right, as well as the works of art. Now, I think as we've got to Watts, I will hand back to Daniel to take things forward with what happened next.
Wonderful, thank you, Tobit. So from that great span of time and building type, I'm going to focus right in on one specific location, which is the source of certainly one of the two pictures, the two works we're looking at this evening. So to get your bearings, we're looking at a map of part of the Holland estate from 1862. Running across the bottom is Kensington Road, now Kensington High Street. And of course, in the center, Holland House, the remains of which some of you will be very familiar with, following its loss through a firebomb in the Second World War. It, of course, had enormous grounds and estate originally, but through the 19th century, really for financial reasons, parts of it had begun to be sold off, and you can see the encroachment to the west here. It was the home at the period we're talking about of the fourth Baron Holland and his wife Augusta, and they were great friends with George Frederick Watts. Lord Holland had been the British representative, the diplomatic representative to the court of Tuscany in Florence, and Watts, as a young artist, had sort of been taken into the household, really seen as a kind of genius in the making. He established, let's say, a close relationship with Augusta, which is perhaps portrayed in this portrait of her, which is at the Watts Gallery. And on their return to London, he sort of had free reign of Holland House. He painted decoration within it, and he was instrumental in brokering new tenants for Little Holland House. And you'll see Little Holland House is indicated there, and to give you a sense of where it is in relation to Leighton House, the lower arrow indicates where Leighton House now stands, so work had not yet started on it. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see an image of Little Holland House, not an architecturally distinguished building, but a very attractive, rambling house standing in substantial grounds of its own. It had been home to Lord Holland's aunt, Caroline Fox, but in 1850 the lease was advertised, and Watts found the tenants, and the tenants we'll see in the next image. And they are a couple, Toby and Sarah Prinsep. Both of them from long-established Anglo-Indian families. Toby had served on the Council of India, was a great authority on all things Indian and a great linguist. And Sarah was, her maiden name was Patel, and she was one of the celebrated 7 Patel sisters, perhaps the most famous of whom was Julia Margaret Cameron, the photographer. Their parents had both died, and so the 7 sisters were very much around and in evidence as they took up residence in Little Holland House, with Sarah really establishing a salon there and making Little Holland House very much a center, a magnet for writers, artists, and the principal attraction, if we move to the next slide, was Watts himself, who in this famous phrase had come to stay for 3 days and was there for 30 years later. He rather argued that it was always understood he'd be there for 30 years rather than this ongoing informal stay. But he absolutely becomes the key attraction. It's in this period that rather than George Watts, he becomes referred to as Signor. And he's cosseted in a kind of rather precious, very artistic, slightly bohemian atmosphere. And you can see here Sarah posing with him on the left, and Sarah with her sister Virginia. And you'll notice here and in the next slide, the conspicuous kind of informality, artistic nature of their dress, far removed from the kind of corseted high Victorian female dress that we're familiar with. And so with them in residence and what's there, Little Holland House is established as the starting point really for why it was that this corner of Holland Park became so much a centre for artists and artist houses. If we move to the next slide, you'll see another view, a photograph of the exterior of Little Holland House. Frustratingly, there aren't any photographs of the interiors. The interiors were clearly quite remarkable, and chiefly for the mural decoration that Watts had embarked on in the dining room of the house shortly after they took up the lease and moved in. And really through the 1850s, picking up on what Tobit said, Watts kind of pioneered or championed a sort of single-handed campaign to reintroduce mural painting. He sort of thought there was no good to be had in a blank wall, that wall surfaces were there to be decorated. And there was a clear manifestation of this in the interiors at Little Holland House. However, there are no images of it. And if we jump forward to the next slide, Little Holland House was not long for this world. I said that the Holland estate was financially struggling and bits of it were being sold off for development. By this time, Lord Holland had died, and the estate, an agreement was reached with the Earl of Ilchester that he would take on the estate and its debts on the basis that Augusta would live on in Little Holland House. So from 1871, in fact, there had been an idea of demolishing Little Holland House to make way for development. And in 1874, that started to happen. The household moved to the Isle of Wight. And as this planning submission shows, a new road was then laid out across the site, curving round, and this was Melbury Road. All along that road, the plots largely were bought by artists who then began to embark on a second wave of studio house construction. Including Watts himself, and Watts confusingly embarked on constructing his own Little Holland House at the back of the Prinsep plot, so directly behind where Prinsep's house stood. However, the murals were saved, and Mrs. Barrington, Emily Barrington, who lived next door to Watts and who was instrumental in saving Leighton House and establishing it as a museum, in her Reminiscences of Watts, published in 1905, gives a detailed account of how the artist Charlotte Wiley and husband Charles Wiley, her artist husband, were friends of Watts, and she oversaw the removal of the frescoes from the dining room. And she describes how this is done, that heavy brown paper was adhered to the front surface. They were then hacked from the back, and she uses the word hacked away, until a small depth remained, and they were then removed and placed into crates. She then describes how these crates were cluttering Watts's new home and in the way. And Watts said there were some 20 crates, more or less said to Mrs. Barrington, you take over responsibility for these. I don't know what to do with them. And so she embarked on a project of opening the crates and seeing what could be done with the frescoes. And marvelously, and shows no need for any expertise in the conservation world, she got her factotum, as he's described, Mr. Alfred Allgar from Wandsworth, to turn up and see what he could do with these frescoes. And so using a plaster mixture that Watts used in modelling his sculpture, he went about consolidating the reverse side of the works. And in the next slide, you then see the images published by Mrs. Barrington in her Reminiscences of what are these post-salvage, post-representation sections of the dining room wall paintings. I noticed that Tobit referred to the curious metaphysical subjects found in medieval wall paintings. I think they had nothing on Watts. There's a wonderful phrase where Rossetti writes to Burne-Jones. Both of them would later become great friends of Watts, but Rossetti writes, "You must know these people," referring to the occupants of Little Holland House. "You must know these people, Ned. They are remarkable people. You will see a painter there. He paints a queer sort of picture about God and creation." And so this very particular language that visual language that Watts was evolving was played out. And of course, the sisters all were roped in to pose for the figures in these panels. As you'll see, in 1905, they're suggested they're at Melbury House, which was the Dorset home of the Earl of Ilchester, but as far as we know, they're not there. They're not there now. The next slide, also from 1905, suggests where 4 further panels are, and they are described as being at Leighton House. So 2 on the subject of peace and war, and then the central pair, the study for a figure in chaos, and then humanity in the lap of earth. We now only have the 2 central pair. In 1925, when Mrs. Barrington handed over Leighton House to the council, she made an inventory which only refers to 2 frescoes, not to the second pair. So where they went and at what point, whether she retained them, we don't yet know. So if we look at those, the central pair, and the next slide, it's absolutely clear that humanity in the lap of earth is described by a contemporary description as being the first in the series that decorated the dining room. And Mrs. Barrington herself describes how it was one of the most beautiful of the paintings, which Watts himself was pleased with the figure of the child. And she describes how she, as she says here, had it framed separately. Whereas, so the provenance of that as being part of the dining room sequence is very clear. The next slide, and this is really only something that we've, in the last couple of days, made progress with. So Mrs. Barrington distinguishes the second work as being a study for chaos. So chaos is a huge work by Watts in the Tate. And while you can see from this detail, it relates to that painting, it's not clearly a study for any of the figures within it. And Tobit is working at Eastnor Castle and had come across images, and the next slide will show it, of a set of frescoes which had been removed from the home of Virginia, the London home of Virginia Summers, one of the Pattle sisters, as a sequence on the subject of the elements. And clearly the fragment we have, if it relates to anything, it relates much more closely to this than to chaos. And so if it is a study, it must be a study, and certainly the dates kind of tie in, that it would be a study for this work. The other thing, and Tobit will comment on this, the other thing Mrs. Barrington says of it is that technically this is the only one of these fragments that is a true fresco. And she makes a very definite point of saying it is different to the Little Holland House wall paintings in that regard. And as I say, Tobit will have something to say about that. So I think, in fact, this was not one of the Little Holland House frescoes, as has often been surmised, but it was within the crates in Watts' studio when Mrs. Barrington was let loose on them. And so she emerged from a crate and she framed it. And at this time, just when this was all happening, or a little later, she was, as I say, instrumental in setting up Leighton House as a museum. And so she could find a place where these could go, as it were. And that's how they ended up at Leighton House. And the next slide, and my final one, is just to say that, so really for much of the 20th century, these works, extraordinarily heavy as they are in their glazed frames, have sat in the store at Leighton House. That store occupied the space we're looking at now, but has been removed, that being a 50s piece of construction, to reveal the original east end of the building, and this space will become the cafe space within the new Leighton House. So these works have languished in the store, and it was difficult to think, well, in what context or what would we do with them? But part of our remit within the new museum is to try and do much more to tell the story of the origins of the Holland Park Circle, the significance of Little Holland House, and of what's in that story. And so when we first contacted Tobit, it was about, as they're presented now in their frames, they've become imitations, or they've been made to appear as though they were easel paintings, conventional painting oils on canvas in a frame. And what we wanted to do was to try and unpick that, to allow it to be then to be presented in a way that you could understand more of their origin as these fragments, these surviving fragments, certainly in the case of the Humanity in the Lap of the Earth, from Little Holland House. And where we were proposing to display them, and you can see that here, framed by the brick piers that have been revealed, was not in a conventional gallery setting, but in that amongst the brickwork of the original house, and where, again, that presentation where it's clear what they are as bits of building effectively could be communicated, and they could sit and be presented in a really very different way to the way that they were presented via Mrs. Barrington and have remained up until this point. So that was really what our ambition was, to look again entirely at this condition and how they might be presented. And so I'll hand back now to Tobit to take us forward on that journey.
Thanks, Dan. Well, that gives us a context and an understanding of what we're looking at. To understand how it became, those paintings became these great square blocks that they now are, it's useful to look at a little bit of the history of detachment of wall paintings. It really started to take off from the 18th century. You had work taking place in places like Herculaneum, Pompeii. In many cases, people were taking things off and putting them back on. They were restoring or conserving in situ, but things were also being bought and sold. Things were being cut away and sent elsewhere. Nowhere more so than in Egypt. Obviously, in many of the tombs in Egypt, like Nefertari on the left, Ramesses the Great's wife, a lot of the paintings, wonderful paintings, survive in situ, but a lot of them from very early on were being cut away, were being sold to grand tourists, to antiquaries, such as the fragment in the Louvre on the right. And you will see very many in the British Museum. Sometimes it was because the building was being destroyed. Sometimes it was because there was an interest in having that element of the painting as a work of art itself, separating it from the building structure. And I think this is the key thing. Wall paintings, as you see with the Nefertari paintings, reflect the building on which they are constructed. They take that multi-dimensional canvas and create a painting which works for that. The moment you take it away and put it in a gallery or on a flat wall, you lose that whole relevance to the architectural space. Now, in 1966, there were, of course, the disastrous floods in Florence, and an enormous amount of development happened in conservation as a result, in response to this, one of which was a much more structured approach to detachment of wall paintings. There are three main methods which developed at the time and are commonly referred to. There's stucco a marsala, which is where you effectively cut away the wall. You leave a chunk of wall, chunk of plaster, and the painting on the surface. It is, as you can see from the block and tackle there, an enormous exercise. These are huge chunks of walls. But in terms of impact on the surface, it can often be least impactful. The second, stucco, is where you cut away the plaster layer and the paint layer. Again, you can see that they are faced up with a canvas or a facing, which is flexible. And so immediately you start to have the problem of trying to take away a brittle, flat surface on a system which is itself flexible. Imagine if you had a flat eggshell and you were trying to peel it away from the wall. That's what happens when you detach a wall painting. The third and probably the most interventive is called strappo. You attach a material to the surface, a canvas, a hessian with a strong glue, and then you cut away just the paint layer or the paint and ground layer. And as you can see in that slide, you can even roll it up. Well, think back to the eggshell analogy and imagine what the surface of the paint now looks like. But these were techniques which were widely used, sometimes extremely well. And frankly, if the building is about to fall down and this is the only way to save the painting, there is an argument for this approach. So it became conservation rather than just paintings being taken away and sold. These are a couple in the UK collection, but what I wanted to illustrate here was another change which started to happen. On the right-hand side, we have a section of painting which was cut away from an Italian wall, and it's sort of a funny old shape, and it fits around 3 heads, and it looks like a chunk of wall, albeit separated from its structure. On the left, we have a painting which is, again, if you look at the painting itself, it's cut away in the same way, but it's been squared up. It's immediately starting to become something else. We want to try and make these things recognizable. Works of art are square, aren't they? And they've got frames. Well, this is an important work of art. We've got to make it square. And so slowly the process began of changing bits of wall paintings rather than hacked off pieces of archaeology into easel paintings. On the right-hand side, the Madonna Child now has a little arcade painted above her. On the left-hand side, we have a very nice gilded frame. I mean, that could easily be an easel painting. And so that process has begun. And that is what gets us here. By the 19th century, that was not an uncommon approach. Enormous frames dominating the painting. Dan mentioned that they were they're massive. The humanity is 60 kilos. And chaos is about 4750. These are huge things. So they're very different to easel paintings in what you can do with them. And that really does make a difference. Now, as we heard, there are no records or no detailed photographic records of the paintings actually being taken from Little Holland House. But rather luckily, in the 1960s, rather than 1860s, the process of taking the Carlton Terrace paintings was recorded. And it probably hadn't changed that much. Now, when I was a young conservator working in the Duomo in Florence, I was a very junior part of a team doing a detachment, and it was very like this. You separate away, you have an enormous chisel which looks like a saber, and you cut away behind the painting and you lever it off and you take it from the surface. Now, it's a control process, but it's pretty dramatic. In this case, the gentleman in this picture is doing probably exactly what Mr. Algar of Wandsworth did, which is supporting the back of the structure with layers of gypsum, which is easy to mix, easy to apply, cheap, and very stable when put over a frame like that. So, the conservation of these paintings. Well, these were them in store. I thought I'd put this on because it makes the easel painting analogy even clearer with glazing. Everything about them is no longer part of a building. It is a movable work of art, as we refer to it. So the first thing to do was try and make a space where they could work, and Danstein very kindly allowed us to use Leighton's bedroom. There on the right is my colleague Claudia Fiaschetti, who did wonderful work on this and recorded every element of the work as we went along. The first thing we did was take off those enormous frames so we could actually get to the surface and to the back of the painting to see what they were like, what options we had for conservation. you can see straight away, this is humanity reversed. The back of humanity, just like chaos, is covered with a thick layer of a gypsum material that Algar applied. He usefully describes it, and you can see down at the bottom here that they actually added a bit because it wasn't quite the right shape for the frame. So again, we are moving a long way from a wall painting in a building. If you cut through that gypsum, you get to the original plaster. Now, I say if you cut through the gypsum is incredibly hard. It's got probably got a calcite aggregate in. It's got a hair component, which gives it cohesive strength as well. It is far stronger and far harder than the original plaster layer, which is a thin hair plaster layer below. And now this is one of the fundamentals of what I would say recent conservation over the last 25 years, that your interventions always should be weaker than the original, because if anything fails, you want it to be the intervention, the new material that fails, not the original. Now this is quite the opposite. If anything goes wrong on that, the stresses are transferred directly onto the original plaster, the original paint, and that is what fails. Cutting through it is incredibly difficult and slow. And in cross section, you can see, now, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but the bulk of that is the gypsum. And then there is about 7 millimeters of plaster, sort of, you know, small fingernail side of plaster. And at the bottom, that less than a millimeter thick layer is the paint and ground layer. And as you can see, it's separating away. I keep on going back to eggshells. It really is like that. So it is incredibly delicate. Unlike a canvas, the canvas which is hanging on that wall behind you, which is moving gently around, wall paintings, this sort of material doesn't respond and move in the same way. Or if it does, it separates, it delaminates, it cracks, it loses cohesion. The painting wasn't perfect shape to fit into a, well, effectively they were trying to make it into a Bellini by the look of it, a very common Madonna and Child pose. But that was created. There are gaps at the top. These were filled in with gypsum. That gilded arch was then painted on around it. The bottom of the painting, as you saw from the reverse, was, whoops, let's go back, was entirely made up. That's just an extra couple of inches they've added on, and then that was covered in gilding. So it was being shaped into the type of easel painting they wanted. Fortunately, the surface is not in bad condition. Now, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with things like ultraviolet examination. If you shine something like that at an organic material, everything over the 400 nanometers wavelength will cause a reaction in the surface coatings. Now, in this case, ultraviolet light causes the varnish to fluoresce, to glow. And so on the left-hand side, we have visible light, and that's what she looks like. On the right-hand side, you can see just how haphazard the varnishing during the previous treatment and conservation of this painting has been. There's also extensive repainting. Again, under ultraviolet light, repainting absorbs rather than reflects or causes fluorescence, autofluorescence. So repainted areas appear dark. Now you can see there that her hand must have been extremely damaged because it's almost entirely repainted. So we look very carefully at the surface to try and work out what was original and what wasn't original. And if we started to take away varnishes, repaintings, what would we be left with? We also, or in this case Claudia, did a very detailed examination under infrared and other types of illumination to see if we could see under drawings or any other information about the construction of the painting, which because of its condition didn't really show anything particularly interesting. Now moving on to chaos, similar sort of structure, except there's an additional backboard. Like humanity, there is a subframe. The wall painting section and the gypsum are held within that softwood batten subframe. And that's what keeps the whole thing together. The gilded frame is merely decorative. Like humanity, it is covered with an extremely hard backing, but here the plaster layer is even thinner. I mean, it's 5 mil or less in many places. So you've got this incredibly thin, delicate plaster layer with a paint layer on it, which is a couple hundred microns, backed with 15, sometimes 20 millimeters of this extremely hard gypsum held within this timber frame. We looked at the question of fresco. Now, you saw on that picture I showed you earlier of what's his attempt at fresco, quite good attempt at fresco, frankly. That's what it looks like. It's coarse, it's grainy, you're painting into wet plaster, so you have a very sandy surface. You incise lines to lay out your drawing from a cartoon onto your fresh plaster. Chaos had none of these. It's very flat. The paint is quite impasto. It's a rich, thick paint layer. It is hard to say without materials analysis, which is going to be carried out as part of the next phase. It's hard to say with any conviction that this looks like a fresco technique. So it'll be interesting to see what the analysis comes up with. It looks very much like an organic and oil painting. To me, it hasn't affected its condition unduly. But that then leaves us with the question of what to do about these. Now, we came down, I mean, there were long discussions with Daniel and the team about this. The problem at the moment is not that these paintings are deteriorating, it's just that they have been made into some rather unfortunate faux version of what they are. You don't see them as wall paintings anymore, and the glazing is terrible and various other things. But they're stable. They could stay in those frames. They are a snapshot of conservation of painting treatment in a historic period. But they didn't really fit in with the story that the gallery is now trying to tell about the physical history. You could take off the main frames and retain them in their subframes where they are very clearly chunks of plaster. Even with the square frames, even with this gilded arcade on, they are still pieces of wall paintings. Or you could go the whole hog and you could take that off as well. You could take off the varnishes. You could just about take off that backing plaster. And you could present them as fragments, as odd-shaped fragments. You could mount them on a lightweight aluminium board. There are ways of doing this. It is incredibly difficult for these paintings because of what has happened to them before. And as you saw under the ultraviolet, the level of repainting, the level of varnish, there was an awful lot added. And if you took all that away, what would you have? Well, you would have some very interesting archaeological fragments. It would be a hugely costly and time-consuming exercise, and on balance we thought you didn't gain enough of that story, enough of the authenticity, or that it was justified to go to that level. So broadly what we are doing is conserving them, keeping them in their subframe, stabilizing the paint layer where it has become damaged, and presenting them as in this sort of form with good explanatory material. A lot of the things that you've seen today will put into the explanatory material so people can read the story, they can understand the historical context. Now, once the treatment element is done, yes, and the presentation that Dan showed earlier. Once the treatment element is done, the real conservation begins. People tend to think of conservation as the stuff you do with swabs and scalpels and in white coats and the intervention. And it's like health and surgery. You do the surgery when things have gone badly wrong. On the whole, you want to try and keep the paintings, the people, our patients, as healthy as possible. Going back to where we started this talk, you're breathing in and out, you're affecting your paintings. You're not affecting them that much, you'll be glad to hear. But if you flung your doors open and invited 10,000 people in, you would be doing that rather more. And if you started putting in, or if you had an old heating system, that would start to cause more of a problem. So all of the things that an historic buildings museum has to deal with just to be a historic building museum have the potential to be damaging to the paintings. So there was a study done at Dan and team's request, looking at the environmental conditions, and you can just see in that middle slide, this is the thermal image, some of the cooling effects of historic air ventilation in the house, which affects the painting above quite significantly. This is now very well understood, and part of the process of redesigning and refurbishing the museum is tackling this. It's trying to create a space where the Watts paintings, other works of art are in a stable and benign set of conditions where deterioration is controlled. And I'll finish on this slide just to emphasize that this is not being made up. This on the right-hand side, we have a 19th century, rather lovely 19th century painting where the environmental conditions were wrong. And very swiftly, this happened as a result of a heating sign. So this is a real thing. It happens very swiftly when it goes wrong. The point about a museum like Leighton House, and a well thought through and a well managed project as is happening now, is those risks are identified, they are being controlled. And that's what will give us the long-term conservation of the Watts paintings and indeed everything else that's being displayed there. I hope that gives you an overview of where we are and what we're doing, and thank you for listening.